Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Tomás Mandl. Hello.
Hello, Cassian. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in your podcast.
Thank you very much. So today we have a very interesting conversation about Latin America, potentially parts of Asia as well, by a person who truly has been hands-on in many of these countries. I'd like that you introduce yourself to the audience and tell a bit about your experience within national security, or better said, geopolitics, foreign policy, etc.
Sure. So I've been working for the past 20 years on international affairs with a focus on sort of international development diplomacy side of it. I worked for almost 10 years with the State Department as a political specialist in three different countries, in Ecuador, in Vietnam, and in Paraguay. So like you say, very much a focus on Latin America, Asia, but always I follow global geopolitics is something that interests me, but also in general, about what Adam Smith called the wealth of nations, what makes countries grow rich and what makes countries stay poor. And that's sort of been my main macro interest professionally. And I've been lucky to have opportunities with the State Department and also with the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, which is a private NGO, non-government organization that gets funding from the state, from the government, the U.S. government. So that's been sort of my general approach to international affairs and interests in general, but we can go in more details.
Yeah, of course. Well, very interesting. So can you tell me a bit about the start of your career? How come you got into the field? How come you started to work with the State Department? How did this happen in the first place?
So a little bit of a personal history. I was born in the U.S. because my parents were studying here, but I grew up in Uruguay in South America. So I always, growing up in Uruguay, I always had this interest in the U.S., in Latin America, relations with the U.S., international affairs. So when I went to college, I went very much focused on pursuing a career in international relations. And like I said, in following this interest in international development, the wealth of nations. And that brought me back to grad school here in the US. And then I stayed here and I moved to Washington, D.C. I worked for a private company for a while called AFA Press. And I pronounce it like that because it was based in Spain, but it's AFA Press. It's a company that published reports with the main media organizations, New York Times, Economist. I don't know if you remember this or the audience would remember this, but back in the day, maybe 10 years ago, all these major media organizations like Economy, Wall Street Journal will publish paid reports. So you open the pages and you'll see, a report on invest in Costa Rica or invest in Uzbekistan. So my company where I work, this company, Alpha Press, did those reports, and I work in DC in what was called the intelligence unit, basically doing research mostly on Latin America, but also on other emerging markets. And after that is when I joined the State Department through my spouse who works for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. So she was posted to Ecuador. So I joined her there, and then from there I started working. And then for the following 10 years, I worked in these three different countries as a local hire. I was not a foreign service officer, an FSO. I was a specialist, somebody that is an expert on a specific issue that all the embassies hired, and I was an expert on political affairs.
Very interesting. So if we look at the continent of Latin America now, there has been, especially in the 20th century, much involvement from the US government in Latin America as a whole, politically, geopolitically, etc. There's always been a great interest in it, not only let's just say the northern part, but as well going to the tip to the south to like now, for example, the New Deal is arising with Argentina, right? And so the US has always been quite involved with Latin America, and now much more China has as well. So how do you see that dynamic between these two massive powers in the continent or in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for the past 100 years, you can see that the U.S. during the Cold War had a main sort of geopolitical opponent, that was the Soviet Union. And now the Soviet Union is gone and it's China. So you can go back in the past 100 years and you can see the U.S. Quote, battling another geopolitical rival for obvious reasons of proximity and cultural proximity as well. The US is very much dominant in terms of trade and investment, but that has changed very significantly in the past 5, 6 years, where China became the main trade partner for a number of Latin American countries. And that obviously changed the dynamics of the relationship with the US. You have many countries not only increasing bilateral trade, but welcoming Chinese investment and welcoming massive infrastructure investment. Like, for example, the Chinese President Xi Jinping was recently in Peru opening a major port that's going to connect Chinese exports from the region to China. So you see that principal dynamic, and then you see the different changes in the U.S. and presidential administration with a different focus. And the current administration focus on tariffs and on being having an approach that doesn't really follow the established global rules has also changed a little bit the dynamic of the countries. And at the same time, more recently, in the past 1 or 2 years, you had a change in the different political orientation of the different countries. You see, for example, in Chile, we're going to have a center-right president. We have with Milei. And that's also has changed the dynamics of the countries that are more or closer to the current administration, the US. And that obviously is going to open up different opportunities for collaboration or for different engagement in the next 3 years.
Interesting. So when you spoke about receiving Chinese investment,
Mhm.
I'll link it back to a book you wrote, which speaks about this one country in Latin America or South America, which really doesn't accept any Chinese investment, and that is a country by the name of Paraguay, right? And this country has firm relationships with Taiwan for very long time. It's a very established relationship,
Mhm.
and it makes them quite unique. Like you mentioned, the port in Shanghai in Peru and so forth, where you see these critical infrastructure go in the hands of the Chinese government. Paraguay takes a different approach. So could you tell the audience more about your book? How come you wrote about this one country in the region or in the continent, and more about it?
So the book is called Modern Paraguay. It's about obviously Paraguay, and it's a book that I wrote well, I published in 2021, but also reflects my time, my almost 4 years that I spent in Paraguay between 2016 and 2020, working for the U.S. Embassy. And my sort of incentive to write it was that there's very little written about Paraguay, especially in English, for American or European audiences. So I started speaking to a number of Paraguayan experts, economists, historians, and so I accumulated all this research and all this information, and it became very clear in my head that there were there was a book there and with different chapters. So the book deals a little bit with the politics, with the economy, with the diplomacy, the history, and one of the things, obviously, in terms of foreign policy of Paraguay that comes up immediately is that it's the only country that has official diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. Right now, Paraguay is the biggest country by far that has a relationship with Taiwan. But I didn't say this in the book. I mean, they don't get official Chinese continental China investment, but China is the main importer. So most of the imports to Paraguay come from China, officially and unofficially. And then a lot of them get re-exported, consumed in Paraguay, but also re-exported to other countries. So, for example, if you go to Ciudad del Este, is the city that is at the border between Paraguay and Brazil, and you go to the street markets, the shopping centers, all the stuff that you see there is Chinese, and that's what gets consumed locally, but mostly re-exported to Brazil. But at the same time, because of the official relationship with Taiwan, Paraguay gets to receive a lot of foreign aid from Taiwan. So if you drive around the country in Paraguay, you see a lot of aid and development aid projects that are financed by Taiwan. In the current environment, Paraguay is taking huge advantage of having that relationship with Taiwan vis-a-vis the Trump administration. Because of the rivalry between the US and China, right now, Paraguay has a lot of extra incentive to keep that relationship with Taiwan because it can, negotiate and have advantages when working with the US or with European countries.
Mhm. Yeah, when you mentioned Ciudad del Este, like you said, in the border between Paraguay and South America, and sorry, Brazil, there is a bridge. I think it's called the bridge uh,
Friendship.
of friendship, exactly in English, of friendship. And many people come over from Brazil to buy products like technology, etc., in Paraguay and Ciudad del Este, and then drive back to Brazil because the taxes are much lower, right? I often receive videos of the newest technologies from like cars to phones and everything, which they have in this city in Paraguay, right? And so looking at this, looking at Paraguay, etc., uh, how would you say that Latin America gets influenced by other factors, like, for example, uh, organized crime, which happens, which influences the region very much? Looking at logistics, like you mentioned, unofficial trade, which happens quite frequently. Very many people in Paraguay, I know pretty much half of the population, more or less, works unofficially, right? And that I think is a broader reflection for the whole region, more or less as well. So, how can we look at that again from a US perspective, seeing these factors? Yeah,
I mean, yeah, informality is a huge problem in Latin America. You have countries in Paraguay right now, depending how you measure, it's 50 to 60%. Countries like Peru, 70%. Mexico, next to the US, is around 50%. That means that half of the workers work, they don't pay taxes, they don't get social benefits.
right.
Um, and we can spend, hours discussing why is that the case. But one issue that is very common across Latin America is the weak rule of law. So you have laws that are not either enforced or implemented. Um, at the same time, with regulations in the economic arena that are, either because there are high taxes or they are protectionist, that sort of incentivize more informality. And in the case of Paraguay with China, is very clear. Obviously, not having official relationship with China at the same time that you have one of the two biggest markets in the world incentivize this informality and the work that is attached to that. Um, the other reason too is that there in Latin America, most of the economies are shaped or dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. And SMEs in general tend to be informal. And that's because, like I said, because of most of the tax policies, the governance, the economic incentives push them toward that informality. So it's a difficult problem that requires a lot of work. And but at the same time, you have different countries in the region like Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica,
Right.
where informality is low, even though they have in some countries like Uruguay high taxation. But I think it goes hand in hand with having strong democratic institutions and a strong rule of law in general.
Hmm. So, from the State Department perspective, where you worked for quite a long time, to solve the problem of informality, which I know many people will ask, it's been a focus for many presidential candidates and other governors, etc., in Latin America. You mentioned the importance of democratic institutions. Aside from this, what else can these countries do to again receive the social benefits and as well just generally formalizing the economy, right?
Well, like number one, reform some of the laws. Some countries have pretty just terrible laws that are either because they're protectionist or because they put a heavy burden, especially in SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises. They force them to informality. But at the same time, there are many countries have just perfectly fine laws and regulation. It's a matter of implementing them. So in many cases, you have countries where big economic groups have a lot of influence. Just that's the case in Paraguay, where the incentives are not aligned to help those small and medium-sized enterprises, or where they benefit from having a large informal sector. Um, so each country is different, but again, I will work if you want me to provide an overall area of work would be strengthening democratic institutions, helping countries governments become more transparent and help small and medium-sized enterprises connect to the formal economy through good regulation.
Yeah, definitely. I think henceforth we must definitely enter in these topics in more detail because each of these can be a conversation in of itself, right? So let's look at the Caribbean, right? Let's look at a country like Cuba as an example, which I know you wrote about as well.
Mhm.
So how do you see the current situation, status in Cuba? Of course, the US has been very involved there as well. How do you see the country at the moment?
I mean, it's in a deep economic crisis, in a very desperate situation for the average Cubans. You've seen since the start of the COVID pandemic, uh, a large number of Cubans have immigrated, mostly to the U.S. The average citizen right now has, very little access to health, to food. It's hard to get anything from toothpaste to, a pound of meat, chicken or pork, whatever you want. It's very hard. So the average life of the Cuban has never been worse in the history of the country. So for a long time, Cuba benefited from foreign subsidies. For a long time, it was the Soviet Union. Then with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, they received more subsidies, and those subsidies have mostly stopped. So the regime, as it is right now, doesn't produce anything basically. So it's basically in a situation where it requires access to foreign currency through informal channels. One, for example, one incredible channel that they have in Cuba is that they have what is called medical diplomacy. So they have Cuba for reasons that had to do with the socialist approach to providing everyone with free medicine. They educated a lot of Cubans and formed a lot of doctors. And what they do, those doctors, they send them to friendly countries to work. Those friendly countries pay them, say, a $10 salary. The Cuban government takes $8 out of the 10, and the poor Cuban doctors have to live with the $2 and then go back to the island. So there's very little foreign direct investment in the island, very little international trade. But sort of the light that has shined a little bit in the past year has been the local private sector, because the Cuban government is so incompetent and unable to provide basic services. And I'm talking about everything from garbage collection to the distribution of imported chicken. The private sector has sort of been able to step in both formally and informally. So the Cuban government has allowed a very restricted number of private companies to step in and do some of the stuff. And then, like in the rest of Latin America, there's been an informal private sector that's also been doing work. So that's has also been helpful for the average citizen to have those services. But again, it's a very limited and very complicated situation.
Yeah, there's this example during the time of John F. Kennedy when he, of course, started there was the conflict between Cuba, etc. And then he created an embargo, of course, with the goods of Cuban goods, right? And there was an interesting story how basically pretty much the day he announced the embargo, as he was a lover of some nice Cuban cigars, he basically asked one of his people that worked with him to get him a hold of like 1,200 cigars, more or less, and to import them before the embargo was hit. Because to this day, it's hard to find Cuban products here in the United States, right? And I'd like to know more about this one question, which I ask myself quite a bit. You look at Europe, you look at Asia, you look at even like North America, etc. And I'm not saying that everything is perfect, yet Latin America as a whole region, from north to south, has always been a very volatile region, has always been a region with great political change. It has always been a region which has been struggling with various of these issues like informality, etc. Yet it is one of the richest regions or continents in terms of natural resources. It's a very beautiful place, etc. Uh, so what do you think is the key reason why Latin America is in the state there are and why so many people potentially want to leave, right?
Again, easy question that'll take 3 hours to discuss, but it's a really fantastic question. In my opinion, what I've seen is that Latin American politics has been problematic. Unlike other regions of the world, mostly Africa or some parts of Asia, um, the region is not doesn't have civil wars, doesn't have foreign wars. It has mostly problematic politics, where for whatever different reasons, the reasons that apply to each of the different countries, they have been able to have a certain institutional stability that allows for certain public policies to remain in place. So what we've seen a lot in Latin America throughout the history, but especially in the last 20 years, is that one candidate, presidential candidate, wins election with a certain orientation, most of the time with barely 30-40% of the vote, but they govern as if they had the 90% of the vote. They impose their views on the rest of the political spectrum. And of course, when the next election comes, if there's another election, the opposition candidates do the same thing, right? So you have this rapid changes of policies and different approaches that is very not conducive to economic growth in general. I think the main thing in general for international development and economic growth is human capital. You can have all the oil that you want, all the natural resources that you want, and that's not enough. And Venezuela is obviously a case in point. That's one of the biggest oil reserves in the world, and right now it's one of the poorest countries in the region. Whereas the countries that have the highest per capita income in the region, like Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica, even Argentina, are countries with high human capital. But that's also been a huge challenge for the region to educate their young population and to sort of incentivize the creation and the growth of human capital. If you look at the international tests of educational attainment in Latin America, it's usually at the bottom. Like the average high schooler in Latin America has very limited skills. And that also, has a huge impact, negative impact on the long-term economic prospects of the region. The other things that are very common to Latin America that have been a little bit solved in the past year is the issue of inflation. For a long time, Latin America had high inflation. We still have countries like Argentina until very recently, but Venezuela, Bolivia, where inflation has been high. So that's also counterproductive to the type of steady economic growth we can achieve. And the other thing, Latin America is a very, in general, protectionist region. There are a few countries that had free trade agreement with the US, but in general, the intra-region trade is low compared to other regions like Europe and Asia. So that also limits how much foreign investors and local Latin American investors can do. For example, it's really hard. It's sometimes easier to export from Peru to Germany than from Peru to Bolivia. It's harder to build a highway connecting Chile to Brazil than doing something else at the international level. So those are some of the challenges. But again, this is worth a long discussion.
Yes. Your example or what you hinted towards made me think as well. I know that in that same region we spoke about in Paraguay, etc., they wanted to create a bio-oceanic corridor,
Mhm.
which again basically will create a link, right? And will allow the logistic transportation for goods and services, as Latin America is a great exporter of many different products, right? And it is, well, pretty much every time there's always certain issues that occur, especially what you mentioned between the countries themselves, then about the other external influences, which will make it very hard for them to build it. And then some countries might build it, and then one party does not. And then you have to replan again to find a way to get the project done anyway. So to conclude this conversation, Thomas, I'd like to know your opinion on the future of the Latin American region. How do you see it henceforth? Quickly, like in 1 minute or less, if you're able to give a overview for the audience.
So build up on my answer on the previous question. I think Latin America has done a couple of good things in the past years. Number one, despite some of the countries having these inflation issues, most of the central banks in the region are independent and have a reasonable understanding of how to control inflation. So that's a good thing. In terms of foreign trade, the region has become more open to global trade. There's still a way to go, especially in relation to intra-trade. But the Chinese trade and the competition with the US and Europe has attracted more interest in the region and more investors, and that's a good thing. In terms of the politics, despite of all the issues that we discussed, Latin America remains largely a continent dominated by democracies, problematic democracies, but there's no other continent in the world where most of the countries are dominated by democratic countries. The average Latin America citizen lives in a democracy. So that's one area that it's good, but it needs to be developed and strengthened. So those three issues sort of condense one of the main problems that I also discussed in one of my Substack articles, that is the Latin American average labor productivity. That means how much the average Latin American worker produces. And that's very low compared to other regions, and that has to do with the democratic governance, the openness, the human capital, and the access to foreign capital, usually in the form of foreign direct investment. So those are some of the areas where Latin America has a huge potential, but it needs some work to do before it can grow at a steady rate.
Perfect, Tomás. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me. It was a great pleasure.
Likewise, thank you very much, Cassian. It's been a very interesting conversation, a pleasure to be in your podcast.